Halifax, December 5, 1984. Midnight wind cuts the harbor like a blade. 30 men file through a clubhouse door. Shoulders stiff beneath leather. Patches unpicked with shaking hands. Inside, jackets hit the table in a pile that smells like oil, sweat, and history. One color is removed, another is stitched on. No celebration, no applause, only a quiet transfer of allegiance disguised as routine. David Wolfe, Carol, stands near the back, unreadable, as if the outcome was decided long before the room arrived at it. 13 riders go in as the 13th tribe. They walk out branded Hell's Angels. A camera across the street records the exit. Static, grain, headlights cutting through the dark. Someone knew this night mattered long before Halifax understood what it meant. Miss the button? Go ahead. Subscribe now so you don't forget later. The men who walked out branded Hell's Angels that night weren't born into power. They built it. One port, one tavern, one asphalt stretch at a time. How does a man in a coastal Canadian city, without an army, without national backing, position his crew to sit at the same table as the Hells Angels themselves? Was it strategy? Was it patience? Or did he simply know something the rest of the East Coast underworld hadn't realized yet? Hold that thought, because once Halifax became a gateway instead of a gang, everything else followed like consequence, not chance. The 13th Tribe Motorcycle Club originated in Dartmouth, Halifax in the late 1960s. By the early 1970s, they were the dominant outlaw presence across Nova Scotia. They moved through bars on Agricola Street like they owned the floors, parked shoulder to shoulder outside warehouses, and treated roads like runways. Not loud, not flashy, present. Halifax was a port city. Cargo came and went with little scrutiny. Trucking lines stretched inland like veins. Longshoremen and night shift workers lived with more grit than supervision. If a crew wanted to build a foundation, this was the soil. David MacDonald Carroll, born April 1, 1952 in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Thin voice, controlled posture, a leader who didn't need to shout. Men followed him not because he demanded it, but because he never had to. He observed instead of performed. He calculated instead of reacted. There are men who run gangs through fear, and then there are men who run them through structure. Carroll was the second type. He mapped Halifax like an accountant balances a ledger. He learned truck schedules, freight cycles, which piers saw the least oversight, which dock workers would talk, and which bar stools heard more confessions than church pews ever did. The 13th Tribe became disciplined. No reckless brawls drawing arrests. No clubhouses burnt over petty rivalries. They grew in silence, and silence is harder to police. Carroll had eyes on something bigger than regional dominance. He studied larger organizations, watched how color patches could mean distribution networks, not just identity. Power isn't who rides the loudest, it's who controls the route. And if Halifax could become a route rather than a territory, then the 13th Tribe could become more than a local name. Growth brought visibility. Visibility brought surveillance. By the early 1980s, the 13th Tribe was the dominant outlaw motorcycle club in Nova Scotia, a status confirmed in documented sources. Their earliest major external link was with Popeye Moto Club in Quebec, a group that later became the first Canadian Hells Angels chapter in 1977. This single alliance placed Halifax in proximity to national biker power, not through conquest, but through connection. Law enforcement began monitoring movement patterns. Travel between Nova Scotia and Quebec increased. Meetings involving high-ranking members were logged across different jurisdictions. Surveillance reports note plate sightings, club meetups, and familiar jackets appearing farther west than before. Then came the moment that changed perception from regional to national. 1984. Montreal Hells Angels figure Walter Stadnick lies recovering in a Hamilton hospital after a near-fatal crash. Verified reports confirm that members of the 13th Tribe, under Carroll, acted as his security detail during recovery, not hired muscle. They guarded him. This is the first documented moment where Halifax did something no other East Coast club had done. They served as protection for a Quebec HA power figure. Not in Nova Scotia, not on home ground, in Ontario, in someone else's jurisdiction. Respect was earned quietly, through presence, not ceremony. Was Halifax being embraced or evaluated? Was this a brotherhood or a test? Because from the moment a Nova Scotia crew stood watch over a future national HA leader, the Atlantic coast stopped looking like territory and started looking like potential infrastructure. Some investigators later suggested that the bodyguard assignment was a turning point, the first indicator that Halifax was no longer operating as an isolated club, but as a future asset. After the bodyguard assignment in 1984, Halifax changed pace. Rumors moved through the East Coast. The Hells Angels were looking toward the Atlantic. What is confirmed? Early 1984, several 13th Tribe members began prospecting for the Hells Angels. Multiple sources cite at least 8, though the exact number varies between accounts. Prospecting is not friendship, it is evaluation. Meetings that were once open inside Halifax bars moved behind doors, then moved into rooms where only a handful were invited in. Reports suggest some members weren't sure whether negotiations were happening or whether decisions had already been made without them. Because cooperation and takeover feel the same on the surface. It's only later you learn who chose and who complied. Some members believed they were aligning with power. Others worried they were dissolving into it. Informants later implied that information was flowing out of Halifax, up the chain, across provinces, into rooms the tribe never entered. Whether the leak was intentional or survival-based remains unknown. What is clear? Someone was feeding intelligence upward, and someone else was steering Halifax toward an outcome. Were the 13th Tribe negotiating the Patchover, or were they being eased toward it without being informed? The club was still operating under the same name, but the foundation beneath it was already gone. If you're still watching, ask yourself how many members realized the decision had already been made. December 5, 1984. A clubhouse in Halifax stops being a clubhouse and becomes jurisdiction. The 13th Tribe Motorcycle Club ceases to exist on this date. Fact, not rumor. By the end of that night, Halifax is recorded as the first Hells Angels chapter in Atlantic Canada. No gunfire, no coup, just jackets removed, patches handed over, and identities rewritten without protest on record. Inside the room, David MacDonald Carroll does not speak loudly. He stands still, eyes forward, shoulders square, as if the outcome was simply the next step in math. Some describe him later as calm, others as unreadable. The moment doesn't show victory or defeat, only transition. Colors change, black and white disappears, red and white takes its place. A province once owned by a local club becomes a node of something larger, something structured, scalable, continental. The hierarchy clicks into place, like metal locking into machinery. Halifax is no longer a gang. It is a coast entry asset. But power never moves cleanly. Multiple accounts confirm that not every member accepted the patch. Some turned back, some walked away, some simply vanished from rosters and never resurfaced in public records. Their absence is not explained in files, only noticed. Where did the men who refused the patch go, and what were they afraid of stepping into? Because organizations don't grow without loss. A new flag flies, but someone always bleeds off the bottom of the mast. The patchover is remembered as a beginning, but for a select few, it looks more like an erasure. When the patchover was complete, Halifax didn't expand, it activated. A cocaine channel formed between Halifax and Montreal, built through alliances established years earlier. This wasn't street dealing, it was import, distribution, and maritime logistics. The port was no longer background, it was the bloodstream. By the 1990s, Federal records show Port of Halifax drug seizures totaled more than $2.5 billion between 1991 and 2003. Not estimates, numbers. In 1996, one informant claimed that at least 30 kilograms of cocaine were being moved through Halifax alone. Not seized, moved. That is not recreational traffic. That is infrastructure, functioning at capacity. Then came 1993, the Fortune Endeavour event. A cargo ship anchored off the Nova Scotia coast, carrying 750 kilograms of cocaine sealed inside sewer pipes. A mechanical failure forced traffickers to dump the load into open water. RCMP recovered portions of it, enough to prove scale, even without the full shipment retrieved. Seized cocaine is always the smallest number. The real question is what made it through. As revenue increased, so did surveillance. Wiretaps multiplied, phones monitored, conversations coded. Every quiet voice became a data point. Strike teams began assembling case files like scaffolding, structural, methodical, brick by brick. The Halifax chapter had scaled into an artery feeding a national body. But arteries can be cut. When an organization grows faster than its secrecy, does power increase or exposure? Money moved through Halifax, but not evenly. Revenue splits became fractures, not glue. Some members profited. Others watched profit move past them, like freight they unloaded but never owned. Reports from investigators and former associates suggest that original 13th Tribe members began to feel pushed to the margins, valued for history but not for authority. Internal respect thinned. If early accounts are accurate, David Carroll at one point referred to Halifax members as Boy Scouts, implying the new structure saw the Maritimes less as equals and more as subordinates in a national machine. By the late 1990s, only 3 original figures from the old 13th Tribe hold any real influence. Everyone else is either absorbed, replaced, or irrelevant. Brotherhood becomes hierarchy. Hierarchy becomes competition, and competition breeds quiet enemies. Not in alleys, but in meeting rooms. What happens to men who built a club once they become employees of a larger one? Because betrayal in outlaw culture rarely arrives as a bullet. It arrives as silence at the table, as decisions made in other cities, as respect that used to be automatic and now must be earned again or taken back. It wasn't a raid that shifted the balance. The sound that changed Halifax was quieter, paperwork. One informant, one signature. And the walls didn't fall, they thinned. Sources identify him only as Bill, a member who flipped and provided testimony that initiated charges and indictments. And then another fracture, 1998. Gregory Joseph Brushett, full patch Hell's Angel, disappears. No body, no formal conclusion, no confirmed motive. Investigators believe the cause was internal, not law enforcement, not rivals, but the club itself. If a man can vanish inside his own colors, what does that say about security or obedience? The timeline tightens. Paul Francis Wilson, convicted of multiple offenses, including links to the 1997 killing of Sean McFarlane and the 1998 murder of Sean Wendelborg. 2 deaths, 2 years, 1 internal network tying them together. The pressure didn't come from police first. It came from men who once wore the same patches, from disputes that never made headlines and motives that never made statements. Because criminal empires don't collapse through invasion. They collapse when the foundation questions itself. How many secrets were traded before the first arrest was filed? How many conversations were recorded? How many phone towers pinged before anyone realized Halifax wasn't protected? It was permeable, and if one informant could turn leverage into evidence, what happens when 2 do? Because nothing weakens an organization like the knowledge that betrayal isn't hypothetical, it's historic. Carroll's name doesn't fade when the record's thin. It lingers, like a shadow at the edge of the frame. Not loud, not declared, present. And with it come the questions that never find full answers. Did Halifax choose the Patchover, or was it absorbed into an engine already in motion? Some reports describe the merger as strategic. Others imply inevitability. If consent and surrender look the same on paper, how do you tell them apart? Who fed intelligence upward when investigations tightened? We know an informant flipped. We know indictments followed. But one voice rarely leaks alone. So was Bill the first, or just the first we could identify? Which men refused the patch and disappeared from documentation? No arrest records, no obituaries, just silence where names once sat. Absence is not proof, but it is not nothing. And how did Carol remain unbroken by testimony, surveillance, and collapse? Few leaders hold influence without loudness. Fewer survive it without indictment. Carol managed both. No trial, no recorded confession, a vanish point without resolution. These are not gaps in the story. They are part of it, because criminal history doesn't end with verdicts. It ends with unanswered questions that keep investigators awake, long after files are boxed and archived. Some answers exist in sealed evidence rooms. Others traveled south and never returned. And some, the most interesting ones, may sit at the bottom of the Atlantic, waiting for currents to change. Is this a finished story, or one still moving beneath the surface? The truth isn't always recorded. Sometimes it just survives. A Halifax crew once built their legacy out of pavement, bars, and portside ambition. They wanted reach, recognition, a seat at a table larger than the Maritimes. Carol delivered that seat, but payment was taken in silence, not cash. A club that once answered to itself began answering upward, to a network measured in kilos, not kilometers. Influence grew quickly because systems were already in place. Ports, trucks, ocean lanes, and men who understood night better than daylight. But there's a cost to becoming infrastructure. When power scales faster than loyalty, the foundation thins. When legacy becomes secondary to profit, identity dissolves. A chapter that rose through discipline risked falling through efficiency, because efficiency doesn't care who built the first brick. And that leads to the question most people avoid. Was the success Halifax earned worth the autonomy they lost to get it? Carol proved that strategy could elevate a local crew to national relevance. But he also proved that growth is not the same as security, and expansion is not the same as control. Empires built fast don't fade slowly. They break at pressure points first, through leaks, disappearances, indictments, and whispers. And by the time anyone names the cost, it's already been paid. And if you made it this far, you know what to do. Subscribe. Hit the bell. There are more cases coming, where the truth is darker than any fiction. See you in the next one.